Right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. Let's jump into the first roundtable topic that we came up with. We probably heard from our introductions that we have a few people in the room that are service provider networking engineers. They're a different breed of cat, if you will. Things look a little bit different. But as we were having this discussion during one of the presentations today at Networking Field Day 31, we noticed that there are a lot of companies who kind of started off their journey as being more focused on the service providers, and they've pivoted into the enterprise. And why is that? I mean, they're kind of different animals, except they aren't. At the very highest level, when you think about companies like Boeing or Facebook or Google, they don't treat their users like employees. They treat their consumers like customers. They build their networks in such a way that their IT departments are providing services. Now, it just so happens that that model works really well for a lot of things like, I don't know, cloud migrations or zero trust networking architecture, but it also doesn't scale the way that people think. So while the Fortune 50 or Fortune 100 might look like a service provider, does that mean that the Fortune 875 needs to look like a service provider? And how does that scale when my IT department is secretly 3 raccoons in a trench coat with some Python scripts? So I'm going to open the floor up to our fine, knowledgeable, amazing, wonderful delegates. Should your enterprise operate like a service provider? Who wants to get in before Kevin?
Yeah.
Nobody? So I get to go? Is that my green light? So
fine, Cat. Well, it's your blue
yes.
light.
And 100 times yes. When I crossed over into enterprise for a while, and I worked for a large enterprise in between my service provider gigs, and that was something that I was a big advocate for. And this was, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. And there was a lot of resistance then because enterprises hadn't really gone fully SD-WAN and hadn't really embraced moving towards overlays. And I think where you see the benefit of that now is in the post SD-WAN world and moving into overlays, you have layers of abstraction for everything. You can solve complex problems in a more elegant way because your network architectures and infrastructures are not rigid. And this is something that service providers did a long, long time ago, go all the way back even to 1980s as they started to talk about MPLS and what MPLS would look like. So I think taking overlays and building in layers of abstraction to take whatever comes your way, which in the Fortune 50, you're going to have a lot of unknowns coming your way, and putting into a framework that is flexible and without creating a train wreck of a network architecture, those are the first things that come to mind for me in should you operate an enterprise as a service provider.
Good point, Kevin. But when we say that enterprise should operate as service provider, is it specific to an area of network, like only for WAN? Or do you mean for data centers and other areas too?
If you were to ask me like 10 years ago, I probably would have said only WAN, but like now we're seeing overlays used for like, look at PCI compliance, great example. We're using overlay technologies like mesh VPNs to be able to exclude the areas of the data center. Because I know you work in retail. I worked in retail. PCI is a huge thing.
Yep.
One of the things that we're seeing are overlays inside the data center, even within what we would traditionally have called the PCI compliant section of the data center, so that you don't have to have the entire data center in scope. Maybe I have an overlay that is just for the cardholder data environment and just those systems and not the entire network. So I think even treating the interior of the network as using overlays and abstractions like that there's a lot of value for enterprises in that, in my opinion.
Okay.
Yeah, for me, I think the real measure of where this makes the most sense, it isn't so much the size of the company, it's the amount of change that's happening in whatever the area of the network is, or the amount of protection and requirements that there are in the network. So in the WAN or in the PCI areas or in the data center, where you need to respond to user requests and changing, and you're doing turn-ups of services and the like, then that makes sense that the enterprise should be structuring the networking team with a service provider mentality. But if you have a very static network that's literally a set it and forget it type of arrangement with very little change, then maybe it doesn't make sense for you to be moving down this path.
So I'll throw a monkey wrench in here because in principle, I agree with what Kevin says. From a technology standpoint, you should absolutely be treating these things kind of almost like something that allows you to build in the things that you want to build in. But I think the biggest difference between a service provider serving their customers and an IT department serving an enterprise is two magical little letters. No. Service providers can tell their customers we can't do something because of a technology limitation, because of a legal limitation. When's the last time the IT department got to tell their stakeholders, no, we can't do that? We're expected to solve all of the problems because it's a business process situation here. And unfortunately, unlike a service provider, where if Akamai or Lumen or whoever I'm using can't deliver my service, I'll just go buy somebody else's service. But this is a sunk cost for us. By God, we spent all of this money on these Catalyst 6500s or whatever the switch might be. And it needs to do the thing we were promised by the salespeople, or that you as IT told us it could do when we bought them for you in the first place. So can we live in a world where the service provider is not allowed to say, no, we can't do that?
That's not exactly true, though, because, in the corporations that I worked for, we got no all the time. And it's usually around things like PCI or HIPAA or the legal department and other regulations. There's lots of things they say no to and that you can't do. And these are the people you need to team up with to structure the things in the network.
So are they saying, no, we can't do that for X? Or are they saying, no, we need to fix this? Because to me, let's be fair, there's a bright line, kind of like what Kevin was saying. PCI card data should never be visible to anybody who's not the payment processor or anybody who's qualified to see it. That's an easy no, because that's a no that involves a dollar amount. But what if what comes back is, oh, well, the development team needs us to be able to do like port provisioning on a on-demand basis because they need to be able to, configure this layer 1 switch to be able to tie all this stuff together. We don't have one of those. We can't make that work. No.
I think, Tom, there's an interesting side effect that came out of the cloud providers as part of this. With this point about enterprise saying no was very much a problem, right? It was always expected that enterprise network department would fix the problems of the application. We would provide the resiliency of the application. Now, if you go to a service provider, they're just going to say, look, this is the option, pick from the list what you want.
Mm-hmm.
This is what we sell. Some of them, literally, if there isn't product code for it in their system, they cannot sell it to you. No matter whether or not they're technically able, they won't sell it to you. One of the things that changed with people starting to do stuff in the cloud is when you go to, for example, AWS and say, I need it to do this thing it doesn't do, AWS says, no.
Yeah.
Amazingly, they're able to rewrite their applications and work around it because culturally, the enterprise IT department was never allowed to say no. And I think that's been a very interesting shift, and it's actually enabling enterprise to start shifting towards more of a service provider kind of approach, and certainly more consistency with what we do, and less knob twiddling and nerd feature enabling.
And that's exactly a good point to bring up, John, is my favorite example of this, of course, is everyone's favorite vMotion. We did the dumbest things in networking for the better part of a decade to support a protocol that, honest to God, should never have been built. And I will die on this molehill that vMotion was one of the things that caused application fragility for a very long time. I mean, hell, OTV only exists because of it. But now that because of things like Amazon, where it's like, go find me the vMotion button or the OTV button or the stretch layer 2 cluster button in AWS's dashboard, it doesn't exist because AWS said no. And now that mentality of we are going to provide you what's on the truck. We're not going to go off into the corner and kit bash something that you asked for just because you want it. You can buy the Henry Ford model. You can buy any Model T you want as long as it's black. Like, that's what we can deliver. And you need to get used to asking for things that we can deliver. And I think that actually meshes better with modern developer environments. Because if the developers can just come to the IT department and say, I need it to do this, and you break your neck to do that, there's nothing to stop them from asking for 10% more next time. I had a great conversation with Alex from Netris at one of our previous events last year, and he brought up a really interesting point to me. He goes, yeah, we just thought we could query things willy-nilly without concern for things like resource contentions and allocations. And then we tried to query 10,000 nodes all at once, and it was taking seconds for our queries to return instead of milliseconds. We didn't know we shouldn't build it that way.
Well, here's the piece I would add to John's comment about the cloud, and I think you're absolutely right, John. Here's the piece I would add. The tech that enables the cloud to do that is, like, let's look at all the tech that's under the cloud. They're using segment routing with ISIS. They're using EVPN as a control plane with type 5 routes to be able to build what we would previously have done in VRFs. And so all of the service provider tech that lives in the basement of the cloud is what enables that flexibility. So I would go back to my statement is that ability to, everything about what people love about the cloud, which is, you can abstract whatever you want, and the network is going to do it. But all the guts underneath are still every bit of the service provider tech that, we've been running for a long, long time. So that's what I like about it. That's one of the things I thought was great about the cloud is I think it illustrated to enterprise, here's what's in the realm of possible if you adapt the tech that came out of the last 20 years of the SP world.
And you make it available for your programmers to automate so that it can happen faster.
Exactly.
To add to that, that you accept that this is what the technology does and only what it does, right? And in the cloud in particular, one of my friends described it beautifully because I was complaining about a particular cloud provider and their awful networking support. And he just said, well, that's because they don't sell networks. They sell compute. What's their motivation to develop a better BGP client or a better networking solution? They're not interested. So I think you've got to accept with that you work within those constraints. But I do think that things like SD-WAN, as you mentioned earlier, is a great example of abstracting. I don't really care what wonderful technologies it uses under the hood, and same with AWS and other cloud providers. I don't care what they're using under the hood. You just want it to deliver the service, right? And that's where the problem comes with enterprises is how far down the stack do you push the build like a service provider mentality? Is it based on how many raccoons you have? Thank you for that, Tom. Because how much expertise do you have to have in-house before, everyone's model has been, we're going to outsource, we're going to do compute as a service, infrastructure as a service, network as a service. A lot of those skills are just disappearing. Teams are being made smaller because, well, we can just outsource it. We'll just have it as a service.
But John, in that case, not to interrupt you, but you actually hit on something brilliant. If we're outsourcing all of this stuff to a VAR or an MSP, aren't we effectively turning our IT department into a service provider? Only now we're not paying the people providing the service. We're paying somebody else to do it.
Well, what we're doing, Tom, is we're managing third-party service providers to provide the as-a-service service.
Sweet. I just got a promotion to manager.
Yeah, I mean, in all seriousness, and again, this depends on the size of your company as to how relevant that is. But that's a very real thing that's happening, right? Is when you start outsourcing everything, why do you need people who know BGP and EVPN and ISIS? I don't need those guys.
Well,
I don't need any on my team.
As someone who works for a VAR and an MSP, I fully support outsourcing.
Good plug, Greg.
Oh, no.
Please. No, but I agree with Kevin's premise in that the enterprise network should be more flexible, like an ISP, in that they can get traffic where they need it to be. And in a lot of cases, enterprise networks were never built that way. They were built, I need to stick a VLAN 1 down this way because I don't have the time to configure the switch. So we'll just VLAN 1 it all and be done with it.
So I'm actually going to pick on one of our other delegates here because she has a unique perspective on things. So Lexi, you work with networks that could be considered mission critical. Why would you not want to outsource the operation of those networks to people who don't draw a paycheck from the company you work for?
Running it like an enterprise does not necessarily mean outsourcing it.
Well, hold on.
So specifically in aerospace, if you're building a rocket, you're essentially building a bomb. So we have we have strict requirements around not just NDA, but ITAR as well.
Mhm.
So we can't share really anything with non-US citizens. So we cannot outsource, right? We can hire contractors who are US citizens, but we can't actually outsource.
The other thing I was thinking too is response time. It's a whole lot, and this is the model that I used when I worked for a VAR. I literally sold my services on one person to scream at. You hire me, and I will get yelled at, and then I will go figure out who really should have been yelled at and get them all on a phone call together. But it was that immediate response time. And Greg, working for a VAR, you probably kind of get this, and anybody who's ever worked for a VAR knows that too. There are CEOs, school superintendents, directors of hospitals that sleep better at night knowing that you're on their speed dial. And I feel like that when we get to the point where everything operates like a service provider, that security blanket goes away. Because now you're not, Tyler, the guy who's on call for the CEO when he can't figure out why his email's not coming in. It's you go into a cog in a machine. And I was actually at IBM the day that they switched everything over from having a local help desk to having a national help desk that you called, that the ticket was then forwarded back to the local help desk that was working here 2 days ago, doing the same thing. And the amount of hate and vitriol we got for a month over this switch was impressive, because people lost their capability to just pick up the phone and call somebody. And I feel like that by standardizing, by moving things to more of a process-oriented model where we sell what's on the truck, there are very clear definitions about what we can and can't do, it ruins people's expectations of the IT wizards.
Yeah, I just challenge that basic premise that
Okay.
that it's required that it be outsourced to run it like a service provider. I mean, that's just not true.
So let me clarify. I agree with that conceit. You do not have to outsource things to operate them like a service provider. You absolutely can flip that model on its head so your IT department is more focused on doing those things. I'm just saying that for smaller organizations, it's more likely that they'll encounter that model through outsourcing than it would be to shift their IT department.
Right. And how much worse is that for them to have an MSP to call than to rely on the one or two only IT employees that are going to get another job anywhere from a year to 3 years from now, and then they have nobody, and then somebody that has to be trained.
I think
how
Greg
much
thinks
worse
it's a
is
great
that
idea.
situation, especially when you've decided not to run it as a standard service provider. So now they've got to uncover the unicorn that they're afraid to touch and change anything there because they have no freaking idea of how that magic was put together and actually works.
No, and forget that. They will even charge enterprises for any small changes or big changes that you have to do in the network, right? Everything comes at an incremental cost from that point.
Did you just bring up chargeback? You want to talk about mythical unicorns. Chargeback may be that one that's right up there with IPv6 NAT as far as I'm concerned. Because I kept hearing about this from companies like VMware who are like, you know what? The way that you make your network and your systems operate like a service provider is you charge, quotey fingers for emphasis, departments based on how many resources they're consuming. Well, you know why chargeback isn't a thing now? Because we're paying a cloud bill.
Yeah.
Because now we can see the actual dollar value when the marketing department is like, yes, we need that monster 16-core CPU machine running a terabyte of RAM to email flyers.
Yep.
And it's like, no, you don't. But that idea of being able to more closely match revenue and cost generation together is one of those things that we've been trying to do for a long time. Because Kevin, I mean, you and Steve having operated service providers, I promise you know exactly how much money it's costing for you to have an onboarded customer based on how much traffic they're providing. And you
Report.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Like that's a real easy metric to figure out. And I think that if a lot of enterprises went in and did that more appropriately, not using the cloud model to do it, they could actually reallocate resources more effectively.
There is a fundamental issue between enterprise and service providers. So you're talking about, what it costs per port, but you're also being paid for that port. And that was, when I was working for a service provider, the biggest difference was that we were seen as a profit center because the network was the business.
Yeah.
In enterprise, you're a cost center.
Yep.
And so that's, when your chargebacks come through, the one great thing about, AWS and Azure and so on is I can tag things and I can make people pay back for them. So, but it does also give you a very different perspective on what it costs to go out and get things done.
And that's how shadow IT happens, right? I worked for a university for a long time, and they started trying to do the chargeback method, and people just, like for phones, right? They just stopped paying the service and went and got some VoIP solution, Ring Central or something that was cheaper than what we were charging them for a phone on their desk. And then they have problems
anyway.
And then they have problems with it and want you to support them, and you're like, but no. But then you can't back to you can't say no. We couldn't say no. We'd have to jump through hoops to support whatever they decided to do because they wouldn't pay ITS for the service.
I think it's a valuable thing because we still see IT as a cost center. We always will. Now, granted, accounting is a cost center. It just so happens that accounting is a cost center that has a dollar value attached to it. If we don't have accounting, we don't get the money. But the ultimate problem is that until we can find a way to shift that thinking, and we've seen that with DevOps, NetOps, SecOps, AIOps, Ops, OPA, whatever you want to call it, we're trying to tie operations parts of IT more closely to centers that are more, aligned with what they're trying to do, because no one would ever consider development to be a cost center, even though they really kind of are. I mean, yeah, ultimately they squeeze out an application on the other end that mostly works, and that's what the customers buy. But, you don't think Mountain Dew is free, right? Do developers still drink Mountain Dew? It's been so long since I've been around one of them, I've forgotten, or have they switched over to, mainlining caffeine directly into their veins with EpiPens or something? I don't know. But can we effectively, or maybe that's the case. Maybe what we need to do to fix this is to stop thinking of IT as a monolith. Maybe we need to fracture it into different pieces so that they can be more agilely and nimbly transformed into things. Networking can be a service provider utility for the rest of the organization. The cloud team can be more closely aligned with the developers that can consume cloud resources. Do we just need to blow all this up and start over from scratch?
Absolutely.
I think the other lesson that comes out of looking at the financial side of this, because I'm a business owner now, I have been for the last decade, and so I run a team of engineers, but I look at things from a monetary perspective as well. And I have a lot of architectural discussions with clients that are mostly service provider, but also some enterprise. And I think the one lesson that has come out of the service providers that I think is just starting to make it into enterprise, especially with the advent of the chip shortage and the pandemic, is that when you're looking at per port at what my revenue that I'm getting, it's the product. John's absolutely right. When you're in the service provider side, the network is the product. It's what you're selling. When you're in the enterprise side, it's just an expense. But the difference is that when that's the product, you want to make the product as cheap as you possibly can while still delivering the same SLA and the same value. So the one thing service providers got really good at was they don't just go run to the big three brands for every single thing that they need. They got very, very good at multi-vendor. They got very, very good, and so did AWS, so did cloud. Cloud doesn't go out to the big three vendors and say, hey, give me your reference architecture, for a tier one global cloud provider. They went and got commodity elements and commodity components and mixed them with some big vendors, and they built their own things. And I think that's the piece that, in my opinion, enterprise is really missing out on, is you can shrink that cost center and then return that money back to the business to go spend elsewhere and say, hey, guess what? I don't need a $60,000 switch to go sit in a closet to connect 5 people. Those days are gone. We don't need that anymore. And the commoditization of connectivity to the cloud, I think, has illustrated that to a lot of enterprises. And I think that's the other lesson. It's not just network architecture and looking at overlays. It is how you monetize your network and how you adopt a more multi-vendor approach so that you're reducing your operational expense. Because enterprises have insanely high operational expenses per port. It's some of the highest of any other vertical that you look at. If you go look at energy, you go look at service provider, your typical Fortune 500s have the single highest operational cost per port for things that aren't delivering significant value. That's the thing I think enterprises got to look at changing, and they've been forced to change in the last 3 years because of the chip shortage. And now we have, economic uncertainty. And I think you'll see that change even more in the next 2 to 3 years.
I have to say, it's not a perspective that I normally hear, that adding multi-vendors to an environment reduces operational cost. Because you've got to support multiple vendors. And again, this may depend on how big you are, how much tolerance you have for that skill set blending. But, in a lot of cases, yay, white box switching, let's go for it, right?
Well, it's not just white box.
Having people, as an example.
It's the right vendor, right?
But it's also the commoditization, right? There are options out there and people don't go for them. Why?
It's unfamiliarity. It's investing in VARs instead of investing in people, in my opinion. It's investing in that outsourcing instead of investing in the right people, because look at the scale. Like, even largest enterprise I worked for, we had 70,000 routers and switches. That's about how many I had. 16 global data centers. I had 70,000 routers and switches. Almost all of it was the big green bridge, right? But that doesn't hold a candle to the scale of AWS and the average 5G service provider and the scale of what you're building. So the financial scale of building that with all that major vendor is impossible. It's just, we couldn't build 5G if we did it that way. So the model's there, the ability to build it at scale that's far larger, than what most enterprises are dealing with is possible. It's just the inflexibility of wanting to go consume that, invest in people, instead of investing in, give me my reference architecture, give me my warm, fuzzy tack blanket.
So I'll poke Kevin, because I've kind of worked in this area a little bit, and then I'll give Tyler an opportunity to respond. But first of all, you got a little capitalism right here.
Just right on this side?
Just right on this side. Right.
You get my money side?
Yeah. No, the problem is that, to me, the reason why people love to invest in other people's solutions to that problem comes down to the fact that I can amortize that solution over a period of 5 years and write it off. And a $60,000 switch is a whole lot more palatable to my bottom line, amortized over 5, 6, 7 years, than a cost center of an employee who requires me to pay payroll taxes and things like that. And in a service provider where you're focused on providing services to other people, you look at your employees as resources that are going to be here anyway. They're the sunk costs that are going to go out and figure out what the best solution for this is. And they're going to try to implement solutions. And if things break, they have the time to work on fixing them. But if I can buy this shiny new widget from whatever company that has a arrow or a bridge or whatever in their logo, I also buy one of those shiny support contracts so I can call somebody and yell at them when it's broken. And I trust those people to fix it more than my people, because my people are just money holes that I keep pouring funds into and nothing ever works right. And this is going to be the thing that fixes it, because the guy who needs to make his boat payment promised that this is the thing that's going to fix it. And it's a vicious cycle, because the person who needs to make the boat payment this month needs to make the boat payment next month. And it's never going to fix itself. So when do we finally get to the point where we can include our employees as a valuable asset that outranks a shinier piece of hardware that would allow them to have the investment that would push a service provider mindset out to people?
Can I name names?
I mean,
So I would say, I won't name names, but I would tell you the model you need to go look at. There is a large grocery store in the US that was a typical enterprise. They moved to an entire commodity model. And in doing so, it happened right before the pandemic. If you go read their story and go read that journey, they went from a monolithic, validated, typical large vendor design into something that they built because they hired a DevOps team. And right as the pandemic was hitting, they were able to go move to e-commerce and pivot into competing with Amazon grocery, to be able to go deliver that, because they built exactly what they needed. They built exactly what they needed to consume. They built exactly what they needed instead of what the vendor said that they needed. So had they not done that, had they not made that choice and invested in a team that was agile enough to do that, in a platform that they could make whatever they wanted, just like in cloud, then they wouldn't have been able to do that. And they wouldn't have been able to capitalize on that opportunity. So I think to me, that's a great example of where I think enterprise is headed in the next 10 to 20 years. I think you will see a lot more of that. And I think you will see the older model die away, because I don't think it's viable long term.
all right. Any last thoughts before we wrap this roundtable up? Because we need to get on to the next one, because we've ranted enough about service providers.
Okay. Obviously, I'm right.
Kevin needs to work with some smaller enterprises.
Yes,
I
Kevin.
mean, seriously, you can solve an awful lot of things if you've got 50 people who can sit around and scale up on something or develop it. A lot of companies just aren't at that scale. So to your point at the very start,
Yes.
I think with all of this stuff, there isn't a black and white answer to this. There's going to be some kind of level at which it is absolutely practical to engage in that commoditized marketplace and go and build something special. And there's a size below which you're kind of stuck and you're going to have to go and get it as a service from the big guys who can support it because you don't have the people to go and do anything else.
I mean, it's tough even for big guys. There's companies, I won't name names, right, that have actually called in for professional services to help them use a service provider's API because they can't, right? So they actually need the people who are providing the API access to them for their service to come build the software to use the API so that the company can take advantage of it. And this is this is one of the biggest shipping companies on the planet, right? And they don't know what to do and they're handed an API. Which I mean, not that that's exactly the same thing as bare metal and disaggregation and all those things, but I think it's there is this level of specialization that seems to be happening in the industry. And I mean, enterprises have always been kind of a little bit behind the technology curve from some other aspects, right? And I think that's normal. I think it's getting more and more specialized, where you may actually have more of this happening, where more companies can do less, and they rely on more service providers to come in and do these things. Now, that doesn't mean those service providers can't come in and do a more open model, but I think you're going to be paying someone else to do it.